Every mythology contains a supreme figure, a ruler, an authority above all others. The Greeks called this figure Zeus. But what we've been taught about the king of the gods is fundamentally incomplete. The sanitized version presented in textbooks obscures a far darker, far more complex reality that ancient sources desperately tried to preserve. When you examine the original Greek texts without modern interpretive filters, Zeus emerges as something profoundly different from the benevolent patriarch Western civilization has constructed. He was ruthless, calculating, capable of devastating cruelty justified through claims of divine authority. He was a conqueror who consolidated power through violence, strategic elimination of rivals, and systematic subjugation of those beneath him. The mythological narrative we inherited began with a fundamental act of violence. Kronos, Zeus's father, had devoured his own children to prevent prophecy from manifesting. Zeus survived this infanticide through deliberate deception orchestrated by his mother. He was hidden, protected, and eventually raised in secret. When he matured, he didn't simply challenge his father's authority. He orchestrated a violent revolution that lasted 10 years, the Titanomachia, a war that fundamentally restructured cosmic order through bloodshed and domination. This wasn't divine succession through peaceful transition. This was generational conflict. This was violent overthrow of established power. The Titans didn't surrender willingly. They were conquered. They were imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest abyss beneath the earth, suffering eternal torment as punishment for their resistance. What kind of god celebrates victory through eternal torture of defeated enemies? After consolidating power, Zeus established a new order. He took the sky as his domain, the highest position, the most visible realm, the position of ultimate authority. His brothers received subordinate positions. Poseidon was confined to the waters, separated from direct observation, governing an isolated empire. Hades received the underworld, the realm of death and darkness, eternally separated from the living world. This wasn't equal distribution of power. This was strategic subordination disguised as divine allocation. Zeus's methods of maintaining control reveal calculated ruthlessness. He didn't rule through consensus or cooperation. He ruled through fear, through demonstration of overwhelming power, through punishment so severe that resistance became unthinkable. When lesser gods or mortals challenged his authority, consequences were catastrophic and deliberately public, examples designed to discourage future rebellion. Consider Prometheus, the Titan who defied Zeus by stealing fire for humanity. His punishment wasn't swift execution. It was calculated torture spanning millennia. An eagle consumed his liver daily. His liver regenerated nightly. Eternal suffering awaited the god who dared prioritize human welfare over divine authority. This wasn't justice. This was psychological warfare through extreme suffering, designed to demonstrate that opposing Zeus guaranteed unbearable consequences. Or examine the fate of those who question divine authority. Arachne, a mortal woman whose weaving skill rivaled Athena's, was transformed into a spider, condemned to spin eternally as punishment for displaying talent comparable to divine craftspeople. Niobe, who boasted of her many children, watched Apollo and Artemis slaughter every offspring as retribution for her hubris. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic demonstrations of absolute authority through disproportionate punishment. Yet Zeus's most revealing characteristic emerges through his constant pursuit of mortal women. These weren't consensual encounters. These were calculated predations. Zeus would transform himself into animals, into other humans, into invisible forms to gain access to women he desired. He would deceive, manipulate, and coerce sexual encounters while disguised. The mythology celebrates these acts as romantic adventures, but examine them without cultural filters. These are descriptions of systematic sexual predation. Leda, Danae, Io, Europa, Semele. Each woman was targeted, deceived, and assaulted by Zeus in his various forms. Some bore children from these forced encounters. Those children inherited both godly power and the complications of divine parentage. But notice the pattern. Zeus never faced consequences for these acts. No punishment, no accountability. Divine authority transcended moral boundaries. Power granted immunity. His relationship with his sister Hera represents another dimension of his control. The marriage wasn't based on mutual respect or love. It was dynastic consolidation. It was strategic alliance that legitimized his authority through familial connection to another powerful deity. Yet even within this marriage, Zeus maintained his pattern of infidelity and predation. Hera, rather than receiving justice or equality, was portrayed as the jealous, unreasonable spouse. Her anger at Zeus's constant infidelities and assault depicted as petty and irrational, rather than justified response to betrayal and abuse. This narrative reversal is crucial. The texts consistently portray Hera as problematic for resisting her husband's systematic cheating and assault. Her anger is characterized as vindictive and excessive. Yet Zeus's behavior, his infidelities, his predations, his manipulations, is treated as natural expression of divine power. This reveals something fundamental about how mythology functioned. It wasn't simply storytelling. It was justification. It was normalization of power imbalances through narrative that blamed victims for their reasonable responses to abuse. Zeus's relationship with his children demonstrates additional troubling patterns. He fathered numerous offspring, both divine and mortal, but his parenting was characterized by distance, manipulation, and occasional violence. When Prometheus, the son of Prometheus, discovered how to resurrect the dead, threatening Zeus's monopoly on mortality, the god didn't engage in dialogue. He simply killed Asclepius with a thunderbolt. Problem solved through lethal force. His treatment of Athena, his daughter, was complex and revealing. She emerged from his head, fully formed and armed. Rather than a natural parent-child relationship, their dynamic resembled vassal-lord connection. Athena served her father's interests, defended his authority, and executed his strategic objectives. Their relationship was functional, not familial. She was an extension of his power, rather than an independent entity worthy of genuine relationship. Consider Apollo and Artemis, his children with Leto. Rather than receiving unconditional paternal support, they were embroiled in their father's conflicts. Their own divine battles frequently reflected Zeus's strategic interests. They were weapons deployed in his power consolidation rather than children receiving nurturing guidance. The Olympian structure itself reveals Zeus's autocratic approach to governance. The 12 major deities weren't equal partners in collective decision-making. They were subordinates operating within hierarchies established by Zeus. When they questioned his decisions, consequences followed. When they defied him, punishment materialized. When they challenged his authority, they faced isolation or subjugation. This wasn't collaboration. This was autocracy. His relationship with mortals demonstrates additional troubling patterns. Zeus demanded worship, sacrifice, and obedience from humanity. Civilizations rose and fell based on his whims. He would bless those who pleased him and destroy those who displeased him. He demanded human sacrifice in some cultures. He required temples and tributes and elaborate ceremony. His authority was absolute and non-negotiable.
Yet despite his power, Zeus lived in constant anxiety. Prophecy haunted him. Fate threatened his position. He remained perpetually concerned about potential usurpers, whether his own offspring, other gods, or cosmic forces beyond his control. This anxiety drove much of his behavior. His predations served multiple purposes. They produced offspring who might possess power useful to his interests. They demonstrated his virility and dominance, and they allowed him to maintain control through the power dynamics of forced relationships. The thunderbolt itself his signature weapon, represented more than divine authority. It symbolized arbitrary power, sudden, devastating destruction that could strike without warning, without trial, without opportunity for defense. One moment of perceived disrespect could result in immediate annihilation. This weapon didn't create a functional civilization. It created a civilization based on fear and calculated obedience. Ancient Greek democracy emerged despite Zeus's mythology, not because of it. The Athenians gradually developed systems of representative governance, legal frameworks, and accountability mechanisms that contradicted everything Zeus's mythology represented. Zeus demanded absolute authority. Democratic Athens developed checks on power. Zeus celebrated arbitrary dominion. Democratic Athens built legal protections for citizens. This tension between mythology and emerging political reality reveals something crucial. The Greeks recognized that Zeus's model of governance was fundamentally dysfunctional, even as they venerated him as supreme deity. The various mystery religions and philosophical movements that emerged during classical antiquity often pushed back against Zeus-centered mythology. Orphism, Neoplatonism, and other systems sought transcendence beyond Olympic hierarchy. They recognized that Zeus's system created suffering rather than flourishing. They attempted to construct alternative spiritual frameworks that didn't require absolute obedience to an arbitrary tyrant. Yet Zeus's mythology persisted. It evolved, adapted, and transformed through Roman appropriation as Jupiter. The name changed, the cultural context shifted, but the fundamental archetype remained: supreme authority exercised through power, fear, and strategic domination. Later Western civilization would continue venerating this model in political structures, religious hierarchies, and social systems that concentrated authority and demanded obedience. Perhaps most disturbingly, Zeus's mythology normalized a particular vision of power. Supreme authority requires distance from those governed. Accountability is weakness. Emotional connection with subordinates is a liability. And maintaining dominion justifies any action, no matter how brutal or immoral. These aren't neutral mythological themes. These are explicit justifications for tyranny. When you understand Zeus in this context, you recognize that Greek mythology wasn't simple entertainment. It was sophisticated political and social messaging. It was narrative architecture designed to justify specific power structures and normalize specific behavioral patterns. It taught that supreme authority was natural, inevitable, and fundamentally disconnected from principles of justice or reciprocal obligation. Yet the Greeks simultaneously knew this system was profoundly flawed. Their philosophical traditions, their political innovations, their artistic expressions all contained implicit critiques of Zeus-centered authority. They were describing a god they recognized as fundamentally problematic, even as they maintained religious observance. They were preserving mythology that contradicted their emerging values, while unable to completely reject the cultural foundation those myths provided. What does this reveal about the ancients? Perhaps that they understood something we've forgotten. Mythology functions as more than entertainment. It encodes cultural values, justifies power structures, and shapes consciousness in ways that transcend rational argument. They recognized that Zeus-centered mythology was teaching them to accept tyranny, and they began, gradually, to build alternatives, political systems, philosophical frameworks, and artistic expressions that contradicted the Zeus model, while maintaining formal religious acknowledgement of his authority. The question that emerges from this analysis is unsettling. How much of our contemporary culture remains structured according to Zeus's ancient model? How many hierarchies, power structures, and institutional arrangements still reflect his archetype of supreme authority exercised through fear and strategic domination? How much of what we consider normal governance or organizational structure simply represents evolution of his ancient mythology? Perhaps understanding Zeus authentically, not as benevolent patriarch, but as ruthless consolidator of power through systematic violence and psychological domination, requires us to examine our own cultural structures more critically, to recognize patterns we've inherited and normalized, to question whether authority truly requires the distance, fear, and control that Zeus-centered mythology prescribes. The king of the gods reveals himself not through worship or reverence, but through unflinching examination of what his mythology actually describes, and that examination produces discomfort. It should, because what it reveals about ancient Greek civilization and about our own inheritance from that civilization demands serious reconsideration of the power structures we've normalized and continue to perpetuate.